Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to my talk. I'm Melissa Zimdars, and I'm an assistant professor of communication and media at Merrimack College in North Andover, Massachusetts. Today, I will be talking about and advocating for a media studies approach to misinformation. Over the past few years, as we've become more focused on issues of misinformation, weaponized disinformation campaigns, and fake news, we've seen a lot of ideas emerge from various fields, including computer science, science and technology studies, psychology, information sciences, and I'd like to see more from communication and media studies. And while what I'm talking about is in some ways old hat, something that many of us use to guide all of our research, I think this focus that I'm going to be advocating for today is one of the best ways that we can collectively understand and hopefully address our current infodemic. So I want to start by talking a little bit about how I came to be interested in this topic, both for my research and teaching. In the summer of 2016, I accidentally shared a fake news article. It was all over my news feed posted from my friends in Wisconsin. And it said that Aaron Rodgers, who is currently the quarterback for the Green Bay Packers, had attended a Bernie Sanders political event. Well, as a former Wisconsinite Packers fan and previous supporter of Bernie Sanders, this news, of course, excited me. And so I shared the article without even reading it because the headline was most important to me. And this behavior is not atypical. Many people share news sources or comment on them without actually reading past the headline. But I also want to talk about the differences between some of what was really plaguing our media system in 2016 compared to what we are seeing today. So in 2016, we were seeing actual fake news. So news or articles that were designed to look like news, but that were basically made up or decontextualized information or took information and then kind of ran with it in sometimes wacky ways. And this kind of stuff was being produced primarily for profit, not necessarily as a tool for political persuasion. And so funny examples would be like the Florida Sun Post screen grab below, which it has a headline that says, "Miami man discovers bride is his own granddaughter, but no plans for divorce." So this kind of fake news, and the same with the Aaron Rodgers story, generally isn't very impactful. Of course, it demonstrates that our information sphere is unhealthy and in many ways unstable and in need of a lot of change and support. But many of the stories circulated didn't have a mass impact or one that we can fully measure. Mostly they served to confirm people's existing beliefs, or they were sort of nonsensical. Of course, there were political stories that I'm sure enraged people and maybe did shift their opinions, but studies increasingly show this was fairly limited. I will say since 2016, social media platforms have stepped up their moderation games. Facebook, for all of its faults and continued need for fundamentally shifting how its platform operates, they have altered the newsfeed algorithm to downplay and decrease the profit incentive for many of these kind of what are now traditional fake news stories. And so while we are seeing less of this flavor of fake news, in many ways our misinformation and disinformation problem is even worse than it was 4 years ago. Fast forward to 2020, and I'm watching as the President of the United States, Donald Trump, promotes hydroxychloroquine on live television during one of his previously daily White House briefings that actually functioned more like substitute campaign rallies. And he was doing this despite warnings from medical doctors about the drug's safety and effectiveness against COVID-19. Perhaps even more alarmingly, he also pondered on live television whether there was some way to use bleach in our bodies to kill the novel coronavirus. Afterward, Clorox released a statement urging people not to use bleach. At least a few people were hospitalized or died because of attempts to consume bleach, hand sanitizer, and other sort of homemade remedies. And of course, we don't know if this is directly the result of the president, but it's pretty profound and detrimental for a figure as prominent as the President of the United States to advance conspiracy theories and unfounded medical claims. In 2020, I watched as a viral video of a YouTube documentary called Plandemic spread anti-vaccination conspiracy theories and false claims that masks can make wearers sick, that sand from the beach can build up coronavirus immunity, and that a yet uninvented vaccine for the virus has killed 75,000 people in the US already. And this all comes from a discredited researcher while medical doctors and news organizations worked to debunk it and digital platforms tried to purge it from their feeds. Although it is harder to find and does not circulate as quickly on social media anymore, it still racked up millions of views and is still racking up views to this day. This kind of situation is so fraught that even the World Health Organization said that they're not just fighting a health epidemic, they're also fighting an infodemic. And this is where media and communication scholars come into play. These examples demonstrate one way in which, or one of several ways in which false information circulates on the web. But more importantly, it also reveals the need to examine misinformation, fake news, disinformation campaigns, etc., as beyond just a type of information problem. Fake news and all of these other issues are part of much larger political, cultural, and social issues of concern. This is why we need to understand fake news and other problematic information sources like inaccurate memes or bot activity as an emerging type of online misinformation or disinformation. And we also need to understand this problem by making sense of the multiple overlapping factors that enable, constrain, and shape the production, distribution, and reception of misinformation and disinformation. In fact, we need to use an integrated approach to media studies, or what is also referred to as the circuit of media study. And we need to do this to fully grapple with all of the interconnected aspects of fake news and other forms of online misinformation and disinformation. This model encourages us to consider the ways ideas, discourses, practices influence, overlap, contradict, and circulate between porous spheres of production, everything from the political economy of fake news to regulation and policy in regard to tech companies, socio-historical and political contexts, as well as the numerous studies that seek to understand how we receive and interpret both political information and information circulated on social media. And finally, we need to understand the cultural artifacts and misinformation and disinformation texts themselves. As Dana Boyd rightly points out, addressing fake news, etc., is going to require a cultural change about how we make sense of information, whom we trust, and how we understand our own role in grappling with misinformation and grappling with information in general. I would also add that addressing fake news and other forms of misinformation is going to require changes to who produces information, how we support those producers, how information is produced in general, as well as the mechanisms of distribution and the forces that influence decision-making and specific practices along the way. And considering fake news and other kinds of misinformation through the circuit of media study, through thinking about the mutually constitutive aspects of politics, policy, social media, journalism, and reception, among other things, may offer us the best chance of cultural and political change, productive policy decisions, technological accountability, and for just making sense of our complex and contradictory digital age. So I'd like to start with journalism. Our news environment is characterized by the folding of newspapers, journalist layoffs, ownership concentration, and a greater emphasis on profit instead of the public good. News organizations have to rely on problematic categories of newsworthiness, like if it bleeds, it leads, and the proliferation of pundits whose only purpose seems to be taking up airtime. Because it's cheaper and easier to do, news organizations focus on short-term stories like the classic horse race election coverage and the daily twists and turns of the stock market, and not enough deal consistently and seriously with issues that affect people's lives in a way that explores not only what is happening, but also why and what can be done about it. When we also consider the concerted effort to diminish the legitimacy of the press by conservative media makers over the last several decades, it becomes clear why a significant portion of the population distrusts the media. Of course, distrust varies widely by news outlet and individual, but overall, people trust the press and increasingly the premise of an objective press much less than they once did. Our current media environment also consists of both sidesing ourselves into situations in which vaccines are controversial and climate change is up for debate and easily denied by significant portions of our population. And again, much of this isn't because journalists want to do this kind of work. It's because we have a system in which journalism is not supported, and that system's problems are exacerbated by social media. And I'll get there in 1 second. So, for example, the kinds of journalistic problems that I'm seeing are very evident by the example on the screen. So this image was circulated on Twitter along with a tweet that claimed that CNN on RCN in the Boston television market was accidentally airing pornography instead of Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown. The story was picked up by The Independent and later by Fox 25 Boston and a bunch of other news outlets. All of the subsequent news stories were based on the original report in The Atlantic, which was based on the tweet. Headlines shifted as the story spread. At first, it was Anthony Bourdain was interrupted by pornography. Then it became hardcore pornography, then transsexual pornography. And then it also went from a claim that it aired to sources saying that viewers were outraged, left stunned. But the problem, no viewers were outraged or left stunned because this did not happen. And this is one of the fundamental problems in contemporary journalism resulting from the economic and technological turmoil of the industry. And that's treating a tweet as a reliable source. And then other sources tweeting the original report as fact without checking whether that source or that tweet was reliable to begin with. And so this is a fundamental problem. And of course, like I've mentioned, it's exacerbated by the technological context. Although the history and contemporary realities of journalism are particularly important to understanding fake news and other forms of misinformation and even disinformation, we know through the circuit of media study that's only part of the misinformation problem. To more fully understand the relationship between news and fake news, we need to consider how technologies alter and disrupt news production and distribution practices. Google and Facebook collect about 70% of all digital advertising revenue sales in the United States, receiving a vast majority of digital advertising growth year after year. The lack of digital advertising growth for newspapers is a serious problem because traditional advertising revenue also continues to decline. Couple this with the explosion of legitimate and obviously not so legitimate news sources and other online websites, and the competition for advertising dollars and audiences is fierce. Declining advertising revenue and competition for readers means relying on clickbait-style headlines to try to generate engagement on social media. It also means the kind of stories that I just shared that were totally fabricated by one Twitter user. This also means more native advertising, as well as producing more articles based on information provided by news wires, secondary reporting, and of course, all of these things are cheaper and easier to do than covering a story directly or investigating an issue. These practices, of course, are likely to further erode already low public confidence and trust in news. And of course, part of the problem with the technological impact on journalism is that large tech companies in our country are not under close government regulation and virtually have no oversight. And so connected to the relationship between journalism and technology is technology and policy. The real question becomes, what kind of regulation should these companies be facing? Do we repeat old mistakes and impose self-regulation that will likely erode over time and have minimal impact? Or do we actually do something about Facebook's monopolistic power and provide real public oversight and potentially implement redistributive measures in order to fund journalism? Thus far, we focus a lot on privacy and other issues related to data, but we need to consider bolder, more comprehensive ideas about what Facebook, according to Victor Picard, owes society in return for the incredible power we've allowed them to accumulate. And of course, this goes for Google as well. So I want to think about another part of the circuit of media study. I'm not going to go into the many wonderful reception studies that are out there. Instead, I want to use a personal experience to demonstrate one way in which a solution that is frequently offered to counter misinformation and disinformation misses the point and fails to really account for the circuit of media study. And the situation further demonstrates why we need to be using the circuit of media study and understand the overlaps and constitutive nature of these different spheres. So in the fall of 2016, I was teaching an introduction to media course. After posting a fake news article in the summer, I was already on heightened alert to the kinds of sources my students were citing and talking about in class. Many of them were citing the same types of specious websites that I had shared. When we entered the journalism unit of the course, I decided to create a guide for helping them to identify and analyze what I called false, misleading, clickbaity, and/or satirical news sources. The guide contained everything from political yet reliable websites to full-on fake news websites and satire. The goal was to try to get students to understand the many varieties of information sources they come across online, to teach them how to analyze these sources in order to understand what they were. So I posted this to Facebook because I'm, of course, friends with many other communication and media scholars, and I have several friends who are also journalists. And I asked, what websites would you include in this resource or activity? Well, many of them wanted to share it, and I eventually switched the setting to public. Not long afterward, the story was shared, or the document was shared 25,000 times on Facebook. And it was ultimately shared hundreds of thousands of times in the fall of 2016 and became, according to one industry report looking at news circulation, the most shared fake news article in the fall of 2016. And this was partially pushed along by the fact that NPR, New York Magazine, LA Times, and many others picked up the story. So this is where we also see a journalistic fumble. When the story was picked up, many reporters didn't actually talk to me about what this document actually was, or even confirmed who made it and what my intentions were when I made it. The source was often labeled a list of fake news sites. And although it did contain quite a few fake news sites, it was actually an attempt, like I said, to capture a variety of online sources. My Google Doc spread much like how fake news spreads. It tapped into an issue of growing concern, fake news. It confirmed either the reliability or unreliability of certain information sources, and this often depends on one's personal beliefs and political orientations and ideologies. And it was reported on by some legitimate news organizations, again, without vetting me or the document. Somehow the resource went from an in-class activity to a fake news list, and eventually to a research data set containing almost 1,000 websites used by libraries and schools around the country. And so more specifically, why am I talking about this? Well, even though my intentions were good and I was trying to help my students, uh, the Google document that I made and that took off like wildfire online does not help us address the problems of actual news and really does not make a dent in addressing misinformation. It's really what I created was a document that became like playing a Sisyphusian game of whack-a-mole, a never-ending attempt to try to get a comprehensive read on common information sources, which pop up and close down every day as they're identified. Furthermore, labeling fake news may even de-emphasize the ways in which different types of information sources interact and overlap, as demonstrated by my previous examples, where fake news was picked up or laundered by mainstream sources. And we can see the same thing today with far-right sources that get laundered into mainstream news articles and the way conspiracies bubble up as well. Plus, attempting to label thousands of news sites, of course, is not really a sustainable task, and it comes far too late in the information or communication process. Labeling fake news and other types of online information is also profoundly unhelpful unless the person reading the labels views the labeler as credible or trustworthy. If readers disagree with the labeler or an applied label, it may likely just reinforce their existing beliefs about the source and the information circulated by it. I received numerous emails to this effect, and of course, it corroborates the growing literature we have in this area. People said my resource supported their trust in terrible websites like 100%fedup.com and the Washington Free Beacon, rather than challenging their trust in those websites. Although I did receive thousands of messages of appreciation and thanks for my guide, I also received a barrage of insults and not quite threats to my safety. Instead of contacting me directly, sources like Natural News discredited me as a crybaby, as a leftist totalitarian. Others thought they revealed me as an unhinged feminist, a bogus radical, a loony professor. These websites often referred to me as a communist infiltrator, a super snowflake, a fake professor, truth czar, and somehow both an elite because I have a PhD and live on the East Coast, and a nobody because I received my PhD from a state school in the Midwest and teach currently at a small liberal arts college. Natural News and other websites also publish my contact information and the contact information for my colleagues and employer, and encourage the readers to tell me that they thought I was a moron. This backlash demonstrates, and not to get too far into that story, fundamentally how communication works. Individuals actively decode media text and other forms of communication based on their own frameworks of knowledge, social context, and relationships to production and technological infrastructures, among many other factors. It is thus unsurprising that my guide helped some people, while others did not care about it, did not find it useful, or fully rejected it and me. My analysis and labeling, and later attempt to create a kind of taxonomy or continuum of online information, was appreciated by some, ignored by others, and viewed as the biggest threat to freedom of speech by others still. And so many of the problems with labeling misinformation and disinformation parallels the problems and limitations with fact-checking as a potential solution to our information issues. Just as many readers of my list or the websites that covered it did not trust me, many do not trust fact-checking organizations or news outlets debunking rumors and conspiracies. And we also know that usually fact-checking and debunking comes too late in the process, and repeating false information, even to debunk it, can actually reinforce that false information. So, for example, conservative news organizations frequently accuse Snopes of not only being liberally biased, but also spreading outright lies. The Daily Caller, a conservative news website of questionable reliability, consistently publishes headlines like, Fact-checking Snopes, website's political fact checker is just a failed liberal blogger. Or things like Snopes caught lying about lack of American flags at a Democratic convention. Fact-checking organizations even feel compelled to evaluate other fact-checkers, while fact-checking false claims about their own fact-checking, such as when factcheck.org debunked a meme saying it had exposed Snopes. In the book Reality Bites, Dana Cloud argues that fact-checking misses the forest in the trees, and I agree. Its narrowness of focus on just the facts and where it comes in the communication process, for example, specific aspects of Hillary Clinton's email scandal, that news was already out there. And the hyper focus on it in fact checking does not necessarily help people make sense of or address concerns over whether Clinton is ultimately an ethical or trustworthy person. It doesn't understand why such a story might really speak to people and why such information might spread very rapidly online. By focusing on specific information bits, usually that are incorrect information bits, rather than engaging with the complexities of truth and falsehood or how knowledge functions in service of power and politics, and also by focusing on who gets to shape facts for public sense making, fact checkers ultimately miss the point. Thus, instead of fact-checking, Cloud argues we should be engaged in frame-checking, which is where we try to understand, and again, using the circuit of media study, how and why information is being framed in particular ways, how it's being used by people, the contexts that allow or disallow it to travel freely in online spaces and across social media platforms, and in the reception side further, what emotions it inspires or values it might be articulated to. And so despite fake news and other forms of misinformation being part of a complex problem involving the production, distribution, and reception of various kinds of information, the majority of current solutions to fake news deal too often with just thinking about reception, which comes too late, and with individuals, which is not nearly impactful enough. Viral fake news lists like mine and dozens of other library guides, browser plugins, debunking, fact-checking articles, media literacy quizzes, all of these things are necessary, but ultimately insufficient at addressing our misinformation problem. We tend to advance these kinds of solutions partially because we exist in a neoliberal context, as Dana Boyd argues, again, that privileges and emphasizes individual agency. And it also seems easier to get individuals to change rather than global media platforms, or rather than developing what would be very complicated regulatory and policy rules. And so just as environmental issues are too often addressed by encouraging consumers to buy energy efficient light bulbs or reusable bags, while letting the largest polluters go unregulated, misinformation is too often addressed by encouraging individuals to analyze and fact check sources, while letting a handful of companies continue to irresponsibly control global flows of information with little to no oversight. Thus, the problem of misinformation and disinformation is not going to be overcome just by social media platforms releasing public service announcements or making small tweaks to their news feed systems. It's not going to be overcome by promoting digital media literacy and fact-checking, even though those, again, serve a purpose. And of course, as a media professor, I'm not going to advocate that we don't need more media education. Of course we do, but we need so much more than that. What we need are solutions that focus on the underlying problems with contemporary journalism, the dominance of tech companies over our information systems, and the general lack of public accountability. And we need government policies, in the US at least, that are no longer outdated or only serve to exacerbate the misinformation problem. To address these issues, we need other forms of online information, reinvigorated local journalism, more public funding for media. We also need to assert more public control over our communication systems and redistribute revenue from companies like Google and Facebook to public service news organizations. We need publicly funded social media alternatives. We need to push back against claims of free speech that downplay the necessity of more robust content moderation on social media. And we also need to do these things in concert with one another. Addressing any one of these spheres without considering, or at least considering the others, may not fully help us in frankly revolutionizing our communication infrastructure, and the ways in which our communication and media is produced, distributed, and understood by us. And we need to do all of these things, not just for the sake of having a healthy media environment, which of course we need, but also for the sake of our functioning as a democracy. So thank you for listening to my talk. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email me at zimdarsm@merrimack.edu, or you can reach me on Twitter. My handle is mishmz.